All right, everyone. Who's excited for a science battle? Can I see some excitement in the chat? Okay, so today we have a really exciting one. We are going to have a battle of psychology versus neuroscience. And before I introduce the speakers, can you guys say who you guys are most excited to see? Neuroscience or psychology? Oh, hashtag neutral. Okay. I'm kind of hashtag neutral myself. I'm really excited for both of these speakers. Okay. And to introduce who will be talking to you guys today, in corner one, we have Natasha, the ginger, Vernooij. Natasha hails from Raleigh, North Carolina, but moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan 2 years ago. She has survived 2 Midwestern winters, and honestly, she's not really looking forward to any more. Natasha is a cat mom to the fluffiest cat alive, Pumpkin. Natasha loves to travel, but it's not without risk. She accidentally got stuck in Peru for a week. And once again, representing psychology, we have Natasha. And psychology is also sort of representing Natasha here tonight. So let's hear some excitement for Natasha in the chat.
I'm also representing myself. That's all right.
Yes. Okay, a lot of people seem really excited for psychology. And in corner two, we have Eli, the competitor, Wisdom. Eli hails from La Grande, Oregon. He eats pizza religiously and will fight you over the best toppings. Ooh, I don't know what those best toppings are. Maybe in the chat you can say what your favorite pizza toppings are. Eli is terrible at soccer, but actually considered going pro for baseball. At the end of the day, his compromise, though, is training for the Coney Island hot dog eating contest. Again, representing neuroscience, we have Eli. And if you guys have come to one of these science battles before, you guys probably already know Eli's face and voice, but this is going to be the first time we can hear about his science. So let's hear it for neuroscience in the chat. Okay. And now we are going to hand it over to Josie to show the coin flip to decide which of our speakers is going to be presenting first. And Eli sort of has home ground advantage. So Natasha, would you like to call heads or tails?
I'll call tails.
Okay. Ooh, and it's heads. That home ground advantage really did help. All right, Eli, do you want to go first or second?
I can start things off, yeah.
Okay. And I'm just going to say before anything gets started, I want this to be a clean fight. But do you guys have any words to say to each other before you get started?
Eat mine fast.
Sorry.
Okay. Oh, I was just going to say that I've had an extra cup of coffee today, so I'm in like optimal mental condition right now. So
I've had 3.
And to nail this presentation.
Ooh, 1 versus 3 cups of coffee. We're going to finally see which one wins. Okay. But without further ado, I'm excited to hear Eli's talk for neuroscience.
Great. All right. Well, I'll get started if everyone can see my screen and hear me all right. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today and to present to you all a really cool story about using the molecules from the brain of one animal to control the brain of another animal. And before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I grew up in La Grande, Oregon, which is a really small town in rural Oregon, all the way over on the West Coast here. And growing up, I spent a lot of time exploring the woods around my house. And I also spent a lot of time playing baseball. And it was really, wanting to play baseball that I decided to go to college and play baseball too. But it was also at college at Pacific University that I fell in love with laboratory research. So I really liked this idea that I could use my own 2 hands in the laboratory to do science and answer questions that had never been answered before. So I put my baseball career on hold and decided to pursue a career in science, which led me here to where I am at Yale now. Okay, so now for the awesome science. So in the short amount of time tonight, I want to teach you all about what neurotransmitters are. I'll teach you about the brain of a hydra. I'll teach you about the brain of a worm. And lastly, we'll learn about how to build a neural connection. So to begin, we'll start off with the thing that each of us on this call have in our heads, a brain. And in our brain, we've got thousands and thousands of these specialized cells called neurons. And these neurons, like the cartoon ones here, are really social. They love to talk to one another. In fact, the only reason our brains can operate is because these neurons talk to each other. So what are these neurons saying? And to begin, we're going to zoom in to the location where neurons send messages, which are at the synapse. And at the synapse is a small little space, but a lot happens there. So at the synapse, one cell acts as the sender of messages and the other cell acts as the receiver. And the sender cell sends messages encoded in these molecules called neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are packaged into these vesicles that travel down to the end of the sender cell. They fuse with the membrane and they're released at the synapse. Over at the receiver cell, these messages are picked up by these different receptors that are on the surface of the receiver cell. And each receptor is shaped specifically to each neurotransmitter. So only the neurotransmitter that fits into the shape of the neurotransmitter receptor will the message be sent. And for tonight's talk, I really want you guys to focus on one type of neurotransmitter. That is a neuropeptide. So these neuropeptides are these blue, I'm representing them here in these blue little circles here, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And it's really important to recognize that these neuropeptides have a specific neuropeptide receptor that they bind to on the receiver cell. All right, so now we're going to jump into learning about a hydra really quick. So a hydra, it's this little tiny jelly-like freshwater organism. And in the wild, they're usually attached to surfaces and they just kind of hang out with their tentacles and try to grab food that floats by. And one thing that makes hydra really cool is that they are nearly immortal, which is a totally separate presentation, but I advise you all to Google about the immortality of hydra, as there's some pretty wild experiments that scientists have done. But aside from that, these hydra also have a very simple brain that allow them to do some pretty cool movements like the one they're doing in this video here. And the movements that the hydra can do are controlled by different sets of neurons that are sending different neuropeptides to one another. So here, these green colored neurons are sending neuropeptides that allow the hydra to elongate when it's responding to light. And these blue neurons communicate with neuropeptides to do this longitudinal contraction. And to the right here, I want to show you what these neuropeptides look like when we zoom in on the top portion of the hydra. So the red in this picture is the neurons that are making up the hydra. And the green are illuminating the neuropeptides that are sending the messages between the neurons. Okay, so now that we've learned about hydra, we're gonna switch and learn about another cool organism called C. elegans. So many of you might be familiar with science's favorite worm from prior talks, but as a refresh, right, C. elegans is the term that we usually refer to the nematode by. And they're these really small worms, about 1 millimeter long, and they have a pretty simple body plan. So here's the head of the worm, here's where it lays eggs in its torso, and it has a tail. And what's really cool about these worms is they have a really cool brain. So this is what the brain of the worm looks like. It's often referred to as a nerve ring because it's this ring-like structure. And the reason for that is in the head of the worm here, the pharynx or the throat of C. elegans actually travels right through its brain, which is pretty wild to think about, but that's why it is assembled in a ring. Okay, so now we've learned that hydra and worms both have pretty simple brains, And we've learned that the neurons that make up those brains can be controlled by neuropeptides and neuropeptide receptors. And remember, those are at the synapses between the neurons. And the messages that the neuropeptides are sending within the neurons allow these two organisms to move about the world and respond to their environment. So the worm neuropeptides are sent from one neuron, and they bind to a worm neuropeptide receptor on another neuron, which is nearly identical to the way that the hydra neuropeptide and receptor pairs communicate within the hydra nervous system. So the question that we asked in my lab was, what if we took the machinery that allows the worm neurons to communicate, these neuropeptides and receptors, what if we combined them with the machinery that the hydra uses to communicate with its neurons? Could we make the neurons of the worm communicate by the language of the hydra brain? And this is the concept that I'm talking about. So we took the hydra neuropeptide and the hydra receptor and added it to the neurons of the worm. So now these worm neurons not only communicate messages by their normal worm neuropeptides and receptors, but they're also able to send messages with the neuropeptides of the hydra. And because they have the hydra receptor on the receiver cell, they're also able to interpret that message. So in a sense, the worm's brain has become bilingual and is able to speak both the language of worm neuropeptide signaling and hydra neuropeptide signaling. Okay, so this is really cool that we can make the worm's brain, bilingual, and it can send messages with, the molecule of the hydra brain. But why would it be useful to have a bilingual brain in general? And why would we want to be able to allow brains, the worm brain, to be able to communicate with the neuropeptides from hydra? And one reason we thought that this tool could be useful is if the worm has a broken neural connection that restricts its brain from functioning properly. And I'm going to tell you a brief story of how we demonstrated this. So down here, I have a cartoon of a worm eating its favorite food, which is bacteria. And there's this specialized food sensing neuron that I have drawn as in this black color in the cartoon. And so when the worm eats food, there's this little food sensor, and it's on the tip of this neuron, and it'll detect that food has entered the pharynx, or the throat of the worm. And this activates the food sensing neuron to release a neurotransmitter. And when this neurotransmitter is released from the food sensing neuron, it binds to receptors that are on downstream neural circuits, so other neural circuits that are in the brain of the worm. And these neural circuits are in charge of telling the worm to go into this dwelling behavior. So dwelling meaning like, the worm finds its favorite food, and then it just kind of likes to hang out and eat all the food around it. But there is a mutation that can cause worms to be unable to enter this state of dwelling because they have a mutation for the specific neurotransmitter that controls this dwelling state. So animals that have a mutation in the gene for that, they actually remain in this roaming fast state where they're always running around regardless of if their favorite food is right next to them. And our question was, could we use the neuropeptides of the hydra to restore communication in this food sensing circuit of the worm? So in a worm that had a mutation for this neurotransmitter that promotes, slowing down and dwelling, we put the hydra neuropeptide there now into this food sensing neuron. And when this neuron becomes activated now, it instead releases the neuropeptide from hydra. And in order to make sure that the hydra neuropeptide is able to be interpreted by the worm's brain, we put the hydra receptor on the downstream circuit. So now for the crucial, result, would these animals slow down when they entered food? And in fact, they do. So we have now completely restored the ability of these worms to go into this dwelling behavior by replacing their broken machinery with the hydra machinery. And that almost closes out my talk, but first I want to make a few brief points. So Although the brains of many animals look really different, they're all built out of the same basic building blocks of neural circuits. And because all brains share this fundamental principle, we can use that knowledge to design new tools and ways of thinking like the one I've shown today. And lastly, although the worm and hydra may seem really irrelevant to us humans, I hope I've made it clear that we actually have a lot of the same things in common. And in fact, by learning about how the brain functions in these simple organisms, we can learn a lot more about ours. And lastly, it takes an entire team to do some really cool science like this. And this is a picture of my lab here at Yale. This was a couple Halloweens ago when we all dressed up like superheroes. So I'm really lucky to be a part of this great team. And it's one of the perks of science is being on a great team. So thank you all.
And thank you, Eli, for a wonderful presentation. It seemed in the chat that everyone also was super excited about learning how you can just, make worms bilingual, because it's usually hard for us humans to do that. Okay, but before we talk about how cool Eli's talk was, we need to hear from you about how cool you thought Eli's talk was. So in just a moment, you guys are all going to have a poll pop up onto your screen, and there are going to be 3 questions. The first question is, how understandable was the presentation? Were you able to follow most of what the presentation was saying? And you just need to rate Eli on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being completely lost and 5 being that you understood everything. The second question is, how much did this presentation spark your curiosity and imagination? Again, on the same scale of 1 to 5. And question number 3, how much more do you feel like you know about this topic compared to before? And that's also on a scale of 1 to 5. And remember, be honest. We are, as scientists, are, trying to get better, and your scoring really helps us figure out where we can do better. And in the meantime, if you've already finished the poll, feel free to put in the chat your favorite part about Eli's presentation, or put in the Q&A any questions you have for Eli, because after Natasha's talk, we are going to have a Q&A session between Eli and Natasha to answer any lingering questions you might have. Oh, the diagrams. Yeah, you had some very nice diagrams, very detailed. Really helped show what was going on. Yes, a jolly good show. Yes. I was thinking similar thing. Oh, combining the neurons of the hybrid and the worm. Yeah, that was really unexpected. I had no idea you could even do that, to be honest. All right, you have about 30 more seconds for the poll. Oh, favorite part was the worm's brain shape, like a ring. Yeah, honestly, like so much different than ours, really. All right, just 10 more seconds. Get your final votes in. Yeah, Alicia, it was very cool to see how it could fix the neural connection. So being bilingual means if you can't speak in one language, maybe you can speak in the other. Anyways, we'll hear a lot more about from Eli later. But for now, we are going to bring Natasha to talk about psychology to continue the battle. So Natasha, we're excited to hear your talk.
All righty, 1 second. Oh, that's the wrong part. All right, can everyone see everything? We all good? And you can hear me? All right, I'm gonna assume that's yes. Great, thanks everyone. All right, hey, I'm Natasha. So that's me in the lower corner with my friends Kat Perla. A little bit about me before we really get into this. So I grew up in North Carolina, so that's right here. And I did my undergrad there at UNC. That's where I studied psychology and Spanish. And now I'm a doctoral student at the University of Michigan, so that's up here. And I study how people use more than one language. So I'll also be talking about a kind of bilingualism, but it's going to be a little bit different than what Eli was talking about. And so I speak English, Dutch, which I learned from my parents, and Spanish, which I learned at school. So do any of you guys speak another language? Put it in the chat. Chinese and Latin, very cool. Learning. All right, French, nice. All right, so we got like a huge range of languages here. We got Arabic, Hindi, very cool. Okay, Telugu. All right, great. We have like a huge range here. That's awesome. Thank you guys. Can I? Yeah. Okay. So in particular, I study how people use these two languages and how they code switch between them. So you may have heard of code switching before, and it can mean like a lot of different things. So I'm going to quickly run through a couple of definitions. So one definition of code switching is switching between varieties of dialects of a language. So if you speak African-American vernacular English, you can code switch between African-American vernacular English and like the school taught American English. Another definition of code switching. All right, yeah, code switching can mean a lot of different things. Code switching can also mean switching between styles of speaking. So this could be you talk to your friends differently than how you talk to your parents. So with your friends, you're probably more casual, you use more slang, you probably joke around. With your parents, you're probably not going to use as much slang. You're probably going to be more polite, at least if you're with my parents. And your style of talking changes with the context as the context around you changes as well. So this could be like who you're talking to, where you are, and kind of like the societal expectations for how you should talk, right? And then last, code switching can mean switching between two languages. And so this is what I'll be talking about today. All right, and so this is just an example of this type of code switching where we're switching between two languages. So here we can see a girl code switching between English and Spanish to tell her friend how pretty her cat is. And this is Pumpkin. Great. So a couple of just things before we like get into like the research that I do is like kind of like, why do we code switch? What might be some of the reasons why we code switch? Well, so one reason is that we don't know the word, right? You know, you just don't remember it, so you switch into another language. And so we might not know the word because we're still learning the language. So like if you're learning French, you might switch back into English when you don't know the word. Or maybe the word doesn't exist in that language. So you have to use a word from a different language in order to make up for like the lack of that language. Or maybe you just forgot the word. And just because you forget a word doesn't mean that you're not fluent in that language, right? So we all forget words in English, and I bet you've had a time where you can't really remember a word, but you feel like it's like right there and you're like so close to remembering the word. This is called tip of the tongue syndrome. And so it's like the word is right at the tip of your tongue and you just can't quite remember it. All right, or we can code switch because we want to emphasize something. For example, when I talk about Dutch donuts, these delicious things on the right, I use the Dutch word oliebollen. And so I do this because the word brings with it a sense of home and like the holidays and the tradition of like making oliebollen and sharing them with friends and family. And saying Dutch donuts just doesn't carry that for me. And so I switch and use the Dutch word. And then I must say, my favorite reason for code switching is when I'm talking with my family and we don't want anyone to understand us. And so if we're talking about personal things or gossiping, then oftentimes we'll switch into Dutch. Okay. All right, now we're going to get into a little bit more of like the nitty gritty details of code switching. All right, you might remember from your English classes that we have a lot of pesky rules about how we make sentences and the order that the words can go in. And we call this the grammar of the language. And you probably know that if you mess it up, it's going to sound like really weird, or it might not even make sense. And then each language has its own grammar, its own word order, their own rules. For example, in English, we put the adjective before the noun. So we say, I have a pretty cat. But in Spanish, we usually put the adjective after the noun. So in Spanish, we say, yo tengo un gato bonito, which translates to, I have a cat pretty. So we have different grammar rules. It's confusing enough if you're learning another language. But now imagine if you speak English and Spanish and you code switch between an adjective and a noun in a place where they don't have the same word order. That can get pretty confusing. So you could end up saying something like, I have a pretty gato, or yo tengo un gato pretty. And so it's the same word order, but now you're suddenly switching into another language. All right, so the main question that I research is how do people code switch in places where their grammars are different? How do they deal with these two different grammars that are now battling it out to determine like the word order that they use? And what makes them pick one grammar over the other grammar? But wait, before we even look at how people code switch, we kind of need to make sure that they actually code switch when their grammars are different. So do you guys have any ideas about how we could find out if people code switch in these places? Google Translate. So Google Translate's only going to give you a translation. It's not going to give you a code switch. So it's not going to use two languages, unfortunately. By doing it at the right moment, okay? So I could code switch here, but it's not really going to be very good if I try and do it because I know what I'm trying to research, right? So I want to make sure that other people are doing it and that I'm not forcing them to do it. So one thing that we can do is listen to what people say when they code switch. So essentially, we're going to eavesdrop on them now. All right. So what this often looks like is that a researcher will go out and talk to someone and then record that information or that conversation. Or maybe they'll get their friends to record conversations at grocery stores, the park, or even Zoom calls. And here we can see that the researcher is using her laptop to record a conversation. The researcher will then take these recordings, go home, sit at their desk, and listen and write down everything that everyone says in the conversation. From there, they can look at now this transcript, this data set of the conversation, and look at where, if there are code switches, where those code switches happen, and any other questions that they have. And a lot of times, researchers will then publish the recordings and the written record so that other people can use them for their own research. I'm about to show you what one of these data sets looks like. All right, this is a lot. I'll walk us through it. So this is an example of a recording from Miami, Florida. And so these researchers picked Miami because they were interested in Spanish and English code switching, and 92% of Miami's population speaks Spanish, right? And so that's a pretty high chance people are going to be using both Spanish and English. All right, now to dissect this picture. So first, we can see that there's a speaker. This is Elle. Then we can see what she says. She said, I'm going to have gray manchas all over myself. And very clearly, we can see that there's a lot of stuff going on right here. This is what we call tagging the speech. It lets us know that there's like something interesting or something that we should pay attention to at this part of the text. And what this is telling us, the spa, is that manchas is in Spanish, whereas the rest of the sentence is in English. We can also tag other parts of the speech. So we can see that gray is tagged as an adjective. That's what the ADJ stands for. All right, and then last, we can see what the full translation is. So this is, I'm going to have gray marks all over myself right now. Cool. So what do I do with this data? It's kind of a lot of data. There's a lot going on. What do I do with it? Well, essentially, I look at every single time that there's an adjective and a noun in any order next to each other. So it could be an adjective and then a noun, or a noun and then an adjective. And what I found was that there was 1,863 of these adjective noun combinations. And then I went and checked every single one to see if there was a code switch between the adjective and the noun. And there ended up being 23 of these had a code switch. It's not a lot, ends up being 1.5% of these adjective noun combinations. But there were some other researchers that had already looked at this data set, and they said that in all of the sentences, only about 5.8% of those sentences had a code switch at all. So this is about a fourth to a fifth of that percent. So it's not that low. So it's nice to know that people do code switch when their grammars are not the same. And you may even have noticed in that example that I put up that that example had a code switch between an adjective and a noun. Gray is the adjective and manchas is the noun. All right. I also looked at the order of the words in each of the code switches. So this allows me to figure out which language's grammar the speaker is using. All right, so there's 4 combinations in which you can code switch the words pretty cat. The first is to have cat bonita, which is a noun, then an adjective. And this follows Spanish word order. And there were 4 of these types of code switches. All right, then you can say gato pretty. This also follows Spanish word order. There were also 4 of these. And then you can say pretty gato. So this is an adjective and a noun. That's English word order. There were 12 of these. And last, you can say bonito cat. Again, English word order, and there were 9 of these. So just off the bat, we can see that there's far more English code switches that follow English word order than Spanish word order. And again, this example at the bottom follows English word order. It's adjective and then noun. All right, so the next question is kind of like, why might someone pick English word order as opposed to Spanish word order? So let's use that example, that Gray Manches example, to see why L may have used English word order. So the researchers who created this data set asked all of the speakers to answer some questions about their lives, and those questions might help us. So for example, these conversations were recorded in 2008, and Elle was 19 at that time. She was living in Miami and working as an office receptionist there. She lived in Cuba for about half of her life and then moved to Miami. So she spent about 9 years in both. And then she learned Spanish as a baby. Before the age of 2 is when she learned it, and she learned English in middle school. So this was about your age, actually, is when she learned English. And this is when she moved to the US. And then her elementary school was all in Spanish, but her middle and high schools used both Spanish and English. And last but not least, her speaking comfort is that she feels comfortable having long conversations in both languages. All right. So where she lived, the history of her language experience, or the history of how she learned her languages and the language of instruction in her schools are what we can group under exposure. So exposure is basically how much contact or experience you've had with the language. And so, for example, people speak Spanish in Cuba and usually English in the US. In Miami, people are more likely to speak Spanish than other parts of the US. So Elle's Spanish exposure was higher because she was in Miami as opposed to, say, being in like Ann Arbor, Michigan. All right. In comfort level, we can group under a larger category called proficiency. This is how fluent someone is in a language. And this is the only thing that we have for proficiency, but there's other ways to measure it. All right. Oh, sorry. Okay. So both exposure and proficiency can impact if a speaker picks English or Spanish word order. So what do you guys think might make Elle use English word order over Spanish word order? Her surroundings speak English. Yep, so that would bias her to choose the English word order, adjective noun. Yep, great. Yep, you're around English speakers, you're comfortable in English, right? So all of these things are probably biasing her to choose English word order. So if you look at her holistic language use, you can see that she probably had more exposure to Spanish based off of how she grew up, and she lived in Cuba, and even in the US, she used Spanish. And in her proficiency, she seems to be equally balanced between Spanish and English. So in these two, in her overall holistic view, that would maybe bias her more to the Spanish word order. But as you guys pointed out in the chat, her current situation right now, she's living in the US and she's working at a US job. She's probably speaking English at that job. She's surrounded by English speakers. That current situation, that current context is probably biasing her to use English word order as opposed to Spanish word order. Great. There may also be other factors that make Elle choose English word order that we can't get from just looking at Elle alone. For example, if Elle is speaking to someone who's more fluent in English, then maybe she picked English word order because it's easier for the other person to understand, right? Our conversations are with other people and we need to be aware of the other people we're talking with. Great. So essentially, what next? What are like the next questions and the next steps from this type of research? So the questions that I just talked about are things that we can ask about a single code switch made by one speaker. But in a big data set, we have lots of speakers, and each of those speakers differ in how they code switch. So the next step is to look at each speaker's overall code switching patterns. So which grammar do they choose? And then how things like proficiency and language experience could predict their code switching patterns. We can also look at these kind of situational factors like who Elle is talking to or what she's talking about to help understand in specific code switches, like those kind of ones where, maybe she did choose Spanish English word or Spanish word order instead of English word order. And these questions will give us a better understanding of how and why bilinguals code switch in places where their grammars aren't the same. Alrighty, thank you everyone. And also, my research cannot be done in a silo either. So these are all of my lab members and of course Pumpkin as a very lovely reminder to take a break and be happy. So thank you everyone.
And thank you, Natasha. That was a wonderful talk. I'm glad we got to hear about two different bilingual sciences today. And the audience also really enjoyed it. And to continue showing your enjoyment, feel free to say in the chat what you liked about Natasha's presentation. And also don't forget to leave a question in the Q&A section for her as well. And on your screen now, you can also see that you can use the poll to show us how much you liked Natasha's presentation. These are the same questions as last time. Number 1, how understandable was the presentation on a scale of 1 to 5? Number 2, how much did this presentation spark your curiosity? And number 3, of course, how much more do you feel like you know about this topic compared to before? And we'll leave the poll up for maybe about a minute and a half. And once you're done with the poll, remember again to put questions in the Q&A section. And because right after this, we are going to be having both the speakers back to answer your questions.
Sean, I also really like my cat. He's lovely. And yeah, so we can look at like why Elle chose English or Spanish word order. We can also look at like why she just chose English in general or why she chose Spanish, right? There's going to be times where she doesn't code switch. And it's interesting to see when she code switches as opposed to not code switching. And that's another question we can look at.
Well, Santiago didn't even know code switching was a thing. So learned a brand new thing today.
Yeah, that's cool. I know a lot of people who speak multiple languages and they'll switch between them and they didn't know that there was a word for that. I didn't learn it until I was in college, and that was, after speaking like 18 years with two languages. So.
All right, we're gonna have the poll up for maybe just another 20 seconds now, 15 seconds really. So get your final votes in so we can have plenty of time for the Q&A session. And again, as we're about to close up the poll, I just want to say thank you again to Natasha for a wonderful presentation. And we are going to be introducing Matt and welcoming back Eli, who for the Q&A session.
All right, thank you, Natasha and Eli, for such great talks. The kids loved it, and I also thought they were both really, really interesting. So the first question that we have is going to be for Eli. I think the kids this has the most upvotes in the Q&A session, but it talks about the hydra's immortality. I know you said that this kind of involves another talk on its own, but I guess just if you quickly want to talk about what qualities make the hydra immortal, and is there any way a hydra can die?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, it's still a question that I think has yet to be answered. So hopefully there's some future scientists on the call today that'll go and answer that question. We don't really know. I mean, you can put hydra, a bunch of them, in a blender and blend them up and separate all their cells. And they basically will just reconfigure into functioning hydra, and they'll have kids, and those kids will go on to have kids, and it's pretty amazing. So it's a question yet to be answered. I have no idea. It could be something to do with, I don't know, something around, like maybe they have some cool genes. So maybe someone can figure that out and then figure out how you can make other animals immortal. No.
Wow, that is really cool. It makes me think of in the Marvel movies, the Hydra, how they always say cut off one head, another one grows back, kind of, or 3 more grow back, or whatever it is. All right, a question for Natasha. What qualities of a person might affect the code switch that they might choose?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we talked about 2 of them today. So we talked about language exposure and proficiency, but we can also talk about things that are a little bit more like characteristics of the person. So like, for example, one person just might not code switch a lot. They just might decide that like, nope, my 2 languages are separate. I don't switch at all. If I don't know the word in this language, I'm just going to try and find like a workaround for it. And I like, go like around my elbow to get to my nose in order to say this instead of switching into another language. So there do seem to be some just like personal preferences in how people code switch. And then of course, like situational factors. So like in some cases, you know, you're probably not going to code switch with someone who doesn't speak both languages with you, because they're not going to understand what you're saying if you switch into a language they don't speak. So those are the things we can look at.
Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, feel free to continue to put your questions in the Q&A. I'll still be looking at them. And you know, if there's one question you particularly like, make sure you upvote it, and then I will ask our two speakers. Next question for Eli. Is it possible to make a human brain bilingual and have it understand other creatures? It's kind of a two-part question there.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess the question is probably asking, like, could you make a human brain be able to communicate with, you know, the molecules of another organism? And in theory, you could. It hasn't been done yet, that I'm aware of. But it's something that, you know, the project that I talked about, although it's kind of far distant from being brought to a human, you know, you could use the principles of this to maybe design a way to repair broken connections in the human brain. So a lot of like neurodegenerative diseases, perhaps, you know, like Alzheimer's disease, a lot of those cause a lot of loss of the synapse, and so a loss of communication between neurons. And so, you know, we're thinking you could think about a way to restore the communication between those neurons with molecules from, you know, a different organism, and that would, in a sense, make the brain of the human bilingual by using different molecules from another organism.
Great. Next question, back to Natasha. So I guess kind of going off of the last question that was asked, how often would you say do like bilingual people code switch?
Yeah, great question. So I already mentioned that different people code switch kind of at different rates. So when I was looking in this data set, actually, there were some people who, even in hour-long conversations where one person would be speaking in Spanish and the other person is speaking in English, that person speaking in English would never use Spanish, even though they could understand the other person speaking Spanish. And then there's other people like Elle who would code switch maybe 3 or 4 times within an hour. And so it really is variable and depends on the person.
Great. All right. Well, quick question for Eli. That's not really based on the research you were talking about, but someone was wondering who your favorite baseball team was, since you talked about baseball.
Yeah, I'm a diehard Chicago Cubs fan. So up until 2016, my life was pretty miserable, but it's been okay. It's been okay since. So yeah.
I guess, Natasha, you're welcome to also answer that question if you're a baseball fan.
I don't watch baseball, I'm sorry.
All right.
If you're a Cubs fan, that is usually an advantage. So
I'll like log that as a generic answer to this question in the future. And as soon as anyone asks a follow-up question,
yeah, I grew up I'm a diehard Yankees fan. So any Yankees fans up? I see Richard's a big Yankees fan. So gotta love that. So Eli, following up on the last question in some sense, can you make a human think like a frog?
I definitely can't. I don't know how a frog thinks. I don't know if I'd want to think like a frog because they find bugs really tasty, and I don't know if I want to like see a bug flying around and think like, oh boy, I gotta have that. But I don't know of a way to do that. Maybe someone in the you know, on the call tonight can figure that out in the future. Maybe they can make humans think like, or frogs think like humans. That would be kind of scary.
Yeah, that would be an interesting time on this world. All right, so Natasha, the question in the chat is, how does a person that is trilingual or polylingual affect how they code switch?
I don't know. So no one has looked at that because that gets way too complicated or very fast. At least we're not at the point where we can like answer that in a good way. So we're just looking, for example, like I'm looking at adjective noun pairs between Spanish and English. But if you add in another language, so for example, I could add in Dutch, So I could see Dutch follows or has the same adjective noun word order as English. So I could see these people tending to go more towards the adjective and then noun as opposed to the noun and then adjective, but removing it from this very specific context to take into account all 3 languages and all of the grammar rules from 3 languages is going to be very difficult. So if this is something you're interested in, that is going to be a great place to go research.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, a nice portion of the field that's kind of untapped. So I know all of the participants here can definitely try and do that. Another question for Eli is how do you test to see if the neurons are compatible with one another? What tools do you use and how do you use them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of ways that typically it's done in neuroscience, and it's called electrophysiology. So like for one example, if you have 2 neurons that you think are connected, if you stimulate one with a bunch of electricity and then you record from the other cell, if that cell also responds at the same time this cell, gets stimulated, then you can kind of, think that maybe there's a connection there. And so that's like one way to test that, maybe you have some function between the 2 neurons. I'll leave my answer there. Yeah.
Nice, thanks. And I think, so for our last question, I think then we'll be wrapping up, is for Natasha. And kind of, I think you touched upon this a little bit in your talk, but kind of if you want to expand on how exposure can affect a person's code switching.
Yeah, so exposure again is to this, like how much you've been exposed to the language. So like how much contact you've had with it, whether this is like listening, reading, or even producing the language. And so oftentimes what we'll see with bilinguals is that there's something called receptive bilinguals. So they can receive and understand the language really well, but they might not be able to produce it as well. So for example, I would be considered a receptive bilingual of Dutch, where I understand it very well, but it's a lot harder for me to speak it and write it. I can, but I often have to supplement with English. And so for my exposure, I've had more exposure to English. And so when I code switch, I'm more likely to use Dutch and then code switch in English words, as opposed to speak in English and then code switch in Dutch words. So the cases where I code switch with Dutch words are again like those kind of like very cultural words that have a lot of meaning in the Dutch language. They kind of bring with it like that cultural and like personal identity like connotation. And so that's one way that context can affect how you code switch.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. All right, yeah, thank you both for answering all these questions and for fantastic talks. And I will hand it over to Josie to show us the results from tonight's battle.
All right. Thank you both so much for those talks. Absolutely amazing. I think you were able to hopefully see from what people are writing in the chat and maybe also these scores that we're about to discuss, that they were well received. Okay, so we're now going to go through the results of the voting. So if we can get a drum roll going for everyone's. All right. So the first question that we asked you all to vote for both of these talks was, how understandable was the presentation? You ranked this on a 1 to 5, and I took the average of all of your responses. And so if we look here, you gave Eli like almost a 4.2, which is just really amazing. And then Natasha is like a 4.4 almost, which is maybe honestly the highest score we've ever gotten. So very exciting. Seems like you were able to follow that well. Really exciting. Fantastic. The second question was, how much did this presentation spark your curiosity and imagination? Again, on the 1 to 5. And for here, Eli, you're like a 4.1. So people were curious. People like have thoughts. Just about a 4 for Natasha. So also lots of curiosity and imagination here. Our third question was, how much more do you feel like you know about this topic compared to before? Sounds like definitely, at least for Natasha, some people didn't know anything before. So I definitely know more now. So for this, you guys gave Eli like a 4.1. So definitely you guys learned something here. And Natasha's is a little bit higher. So that's great. And if we average all of these together to get our final winner, we have, by the slightest of margins, Natasha as our winner. So sorry to Eli, but both obviously fantastic talks. Big congratulations to Natasha for coming away with the win today. All right, so send your congratulations there in the chat. Very exciting. Okay. So then just a couple more things before you all head out. Up next week, we have a talk to you coming from Taya, who is a graduate student in chemistry. She's going to be talking about how we might see woolly mammoths come back to life, and some of the side effects or consequences we need to consider with bringing creatures back to life. So it's kind of like Jurassic Park, but woolly mammoth version. So it should be a great talk. Definitely come back next week. And then the last thing I want to say is you guys should check out our YouTube channel, open_labs. There's a couple new videos that we just put up that are about like 10 minutes, 9.5 minutes long. One is about consciousness in the brain and one's about soft robotics. So if you want to check those out, they are on the YouTube channel, along with all of the past recordings of all of these Exploring Science events. If you ever missed any or want to go back and watch your favorites, this one will be up in a couple of weeks if you want to watch this again or share it with your friends. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for voting. I know the speakers appreciate the feedback that they got from you. So that's fantastic. Thank you all so much and have a fantastic week. We'll see you next week on Tuesday.